Welcome to HR Voices, a podcast where people leaders share their side of the story. We talk about the challenges they're facing, how they're addressing them, and what changes they hope to see as the workplace evolves. This podcast is sponsored by All Voices, the all-in-one employee relations platform. Hello and welcome to HR Voices. I'm your host, Rebecca Taylor, and I'm here with Natalie Breece, Chief People and Diversity Officer at thredUP. Natalie, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thrilled to be here.
I'm very excited to have you here. And, for those who are new to HR Voices or are new to the podcast, we're exploring real and fabricated anonymized employee relations scenarios through the lens of experienced HR and people leaders just like Natalie. So we're going to evaluate a realistic workplace situation, and we're going to demonstrate how we assess risk, apply judgment, and design practical responses. So our goal here is not to sort of, teach you everything about HR, right? It's really about revealing how strong HR leaders think when facing ambiguity. And we're not necessarily looking for a single correct answer because 9 times out of 10 in HR, there isn't one. And it's not a neat tie-up that you can get out of something.
I wish there was one answer for each situation. Gosh, our job would be a lot easier.
I know. I'm like, if we could have a decision tree that's just like, if this, then that, and it's just super smooth, it would be a whole different experience, right?
Oh my gosh.
Are you ready for your scenario?
Oh yeah, let's do it.
All right. So we're calling this one the overqualified candidate. A hiring manager consistently passes on highly qualified candidates, noting in his feedback that they are overqualified and will get bored and leave. HR notices the pattern disproportionately affects candidates over 50, though the manager has never referenced age explicitly. When confronted, the manager insists overqualified is a legitimate business concern about retention and fit. HR must assess whether the pattern constitutes age discrimination under the ADEA, whether the business justification is pretextual, and how to address it without triggering a claim from either the rejected candidates or the manager.
Man, just a few things in there.
Yeah. Like this is like just a few different things to discuss, right?
Just a few. Man, oh man, that's a juicy one.
So before we get too far into the whole thing, what stands out to you as the most risky or unclear in this scenario to start?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there, but something you said early on stuck with me, which is consistently. You said that the manager is consistently stating candidates are overqualified. So what that signals to me is there's a pattern here that we have to work through. But then there's so many different dynamics to this. It's like the human side of it and how that leader thinks. Then you've got the potential risk and the legal component of this. Is there disparate impact that we have to address? And then the other is like the candidate's experience. And how do we make sure candidates aren't impacted by sort of the leader's learning and potentially bias? So we have to sort of tackle those all individually.
Yeah, it's true because there's so many different priorities that you can weigh, right? And so many different sort of angles as you kind of figure out what you're juggling and who's impacted. Because there's, like you said, consistently. So it's that means that there's potentially a pool of people who've been rejected by this person, possibly for discriminatory reasons, meaning ageism. And, it talks about the scenario specifically mentions the ADEA. So just for those who may not know what that is, it's the Age Discrimination and Employment Act of 1967. And so it basically says that you cannot discriminate hiring or firing someone based on their actual age. What I want to kind of ask you about is we kind of talked a little bit about this in the prep session, is the concept of a candidate being overqualified. Before we even dive into the risky part of it, who decides if a candidate is overqualified, underqualified? Well, not so much underqualified. Let's talk about overqualified. Who should be the one that kind of determines whether or not they're overqualified for a role in an ideal world?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's such a relevant one, to be honest, Rebecca, because I feel like this is happening more and more, especially now that there's more talent on the market than there had been in the past. And so I guess the question is, does the candidate determine if they're overqualified or does the employer decide? I think it's a little bit of both. It's a partnership. I think these things come up through the types of questions that you ask a candidate. I think overqualified is a really loaded word and
Yes.
statement, which is, what does that actually mean? And to me, I think it's kind of step one here is if you hear a hiring manager say, I'm worried this person's overqualified, I think the question that you have to ask questions to them on, what does that actually mean to you? What would it look like if this person worked on your team? I sort of like that as a starting question because I think it helps to uncover really what does overqualified mean to them and how are they thinking that impacts the work and their team. because it could mean that they're worried about retention risk. It could mean that there's a little bit of imposter syndrome for them as a leader, and
Mhm.
they're worried about like this person actually knowing more than them and having more reps than them. Or it could be that they just think that person's going to be bored. So there's so many different components to this that you have to take into consideration.
Yeah. I feel like it's one of those coded words too. Like
Mhm.
overqualified doesn't usually mean that they're actually commenting on their abilities, their actual abilities. It usually means that they're commenting on something else entirely. And it
Yeah.
sometimes is age. Sometimes it is, like you mentioned, imposter syndrome on the manager's part. Like it's like, this person's done XYZ at bigger companies that I've never done before. How can I manage someone who clearly knows more than I do? Right. Like that's
Mhm.
a nuance that overqualify can kind of hide a manager's own insecurities and still be discriminatory against the person who they're discussing, right?
Yeah, I also think it can sometimes like let's just call it what it is. Like I think it could be a little bit of like a cop out. Like you're not
Mhm.
quite sure why you don't think this person's right for the role, and so you just sort of go with that because it's like overqualified, sort of easy to say and like then move on from.
Yeah.
But you guys go back to that part about this being like a consistent thing. I think in any scenario, if it's the first time, you should still be asking the same questions. But if this is a consistent thing, then I think
Yeah.
you really sort of have to unpack is there bias here or what else, what dynamics are at play that are resulting in this sort of pattern of behavior?
Yeah. Yeah. And you're kind of getting into sort of my next question, which is like, what's the first thing you want to try to understand in this scenario? So if you're the HR person, you're sort of faced with this particular scenario. What's the first thing you'd want to understand and who do you need to hear from?
Yeah, I think different HR leaders could take different approaches here. I think you could go the policy route, which is like, I wanna quickly go into an investigation mode and understand what's happening. For me, I think sort of step one is like remembering this is a human, and this human is stating something to you that you sort of owe as their partner to understand why. And so step one for me is like going to be like, tell me more. You're believing. Let's say it's one candidate in particular. Like you're saying this person's overqualified. Like, tell me more about that. What is it that's signaling to you that that person's overqualified? And sort of digging, it's sort of like the question I mentioned before, which is like, what is it? What would it look like if this person was on your team? And hearing out what they say there, and then I think it will help if you just let them talk. You know, you don't interject, you just let them talk. You will learn a lot about how that person thinks. And so I
Yeah.
think that's important, like listening first. And then from there, understanding more. I think even asking a question of like, if this person was on your team, what would the first 90 days look like? And
Like
see
make
how
them
they
go
think.
into the seat. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And see what comes up there. So it would be very much like a discovery conversation to understand if they're worried, if they say, I don't think this person would stay.
Hmm.
Like, what did they tell you that makes you think that they wouldn't stay? What are the things you heard?
That's it right there. Are the things they said or things you heard that make you feel that way? Or are you just putting a broad generalization against this person's quote overqualification?
Right.
Because it's like, whenever it comes to overqualifying, and if the reason is because they're afraid someone's going to get bored and leave, as it's mentioned sort of in this scenario, and I've seen this so many times. I spent so many years in recruiting that I would always roll my eyes at that because I'd be like, let them decide that. Let them decide if they're going to get bored or if they're
Mhm.
going to leave. But like, sometimes someone needs to step back. Maybe someone was in a role before that, that just was no longer compatible with their stage of life or their interest. And they need to kind of like, you know, go into something that's a little bit less than their typical skill set would allow because they're sick of being maxed out, right? Like, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get bored and leave unless they say something that indicates that. But I love that you just
Right.
said that.
Exactly. And I actually don't think there's anything wrong with the manager stating that to the candidate in a way of like, hey,
Yeah.
I noticed you have a lot of experience. You've been in this field for many, many years. I worry you might get bored. And
Yeah.
see how they respond to that. Or hey, like, you've done something, you've managed a team before. This is an individual contributor role. Why are you interested in making that shift? Versus like the leader or manager making an
That
assumption
call.
about why that person might want
Yeah.
that role.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just going to ask you about assumptions. So what are some assumptions that you're trying to be very careful to not make right now as the HR person?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would want to assume positive intent. So I think that the first thing is like I don't want to assume this person feels like they don't want to hire them because of their age. I will watch for cues that that is the
Mhm.
case, but I don't wanna make that assumption. I also don't want to assume that this person has, yeah, has the reps to sort of know whether or not this is like a bias thing, or they may. I think a lot of times in HR, we assume people have had like formal interview training,
Yeah.
or that they've had enough experience to understand, like, how do you really ask the right questions to assess talent. I would wanna make sure we don't assume that, and we go back and ask, like, what questions are you asking? What are you looking for in this interview process that are helping you kind of get to the conclusions that you've gotten to?
Yeah. I love that. It's like there's so many things that you can just ask people that, it's so bad to make assumptions right off the gate because it's also like, unless you're assuming good intent. Assuming good intent in a situation like this is like the good kind of assumption, right? It's just like, okay,
Mhm.
let's just assume no one's looking to, you know, do the wrong thing here. Let's assume that we're all just trying to move forward in the right way. But I love, sort of just being able to just ask, like, have you ever interviewed people before? Do you know how you're making decisions about how someone is going about answering their questions? Because a lot of times, like you said, like most people just don't know. They might not even be aware that this is a bias. They might genuinely think that this is a pattern or that there's evidence backing up their assumption, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, I also think that because we're human beings, all of us, it is very common for hiring managers to gravitate towards candidates that are similar to them.
Mhm.
Because they've been successful, they've gotten to their role, and so sometimes it's not intentional at all. It's just like, I'm this person thinks like me, this person acts like me, this person has experience similar to me, that they sort of lean that way, and that's where we can play a really important role for leaders of, like, really like, teaching why it's so important to, like, go after talent that's actually very different from you, and the very
Mhm.
best leaders are leaders that hire people that are smarter than them and oftentimes more experienced than them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. Because you at no point in your career are you supposed to stop learning, right? And
Right.
so at a certain point, you might get to the point where you're not going to be learning as much from the people above you as you could from the people technically below you, right? And I'm talking
Mhm.
hierarchy. I'm not talking like,
Yeah.
societally, right? And so that's the thing that I think is like really, really a great takeaway from this, like you said, is like, people do tend to have an affinity to hire people that are like them. And
Uh-huh.
the greatest thing that you can do is kind of like acknowledge that, understand that, and then change that because that's something we're
Mhm.
all capable of doing within ourselves. It doesn't take great systemic change to challenge our own ways that we judge people and in interviews, right?
Right. And what is so tricky about this scenario and interesting about this scenario is you sort of have to do that at the
Hmm.
same time that you're also making sure that this candidate or set of candidates hasn't been wronged, you know? So
Hmm. Yeah.
you're teaching the leader, you're understanding the leader's assessment process and wanting to do the right thing there, but at the same time making sure that you don't have an issue that's then impacting candidates that could otherwise be very qualified for your team and your role.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's an opportunity here for HR to provide more data to help to guide the manager too, right? Because
Mhm.
the manager insists that if they're overqualified, it's a legitimate business concern because they could leave and, it might contribute to turnover. And we know that retention is important because turnover is a very expensive business cost, right? So, like, as an HR person, it could be your chance to sort of run reports on, to get some information on,
Yes.
does age impact turnover? Like, or, does level of experience, like, are we seeing more turnover at one level than we are at another? And then if so, you might find a whole other can of worms that might need to get investigated, which is sometimes what happens in our job. It's like you're
Yeah.
remodeling the bathroom. All of a sudden you have to repipe everything, right? But it's like there is sort of a chance to kind of then, help the manager make a more data-driven assessment instead of just this inherent like gut check.
Yeah, yeah, it's absolutely true. It's one of the things as my title is Chief People and Diversity Officer, I have a lot of passion
Yeah.
in ensuring that you have diverse teams. And part of that is people sometimes think diversity just is it's like gender diversity or it's ethnic or racial diversity. It is so much bigger than that because when you look at the makeup of a team, if you're somebody who believes that diverse teams win, that they're more successful, you want to look at it at every level of, do you have generational diversity? Do you have experiential diversity? Do you have then you have all the other things like, gender and race, etc. But the teams that tend to be the most successful are those that have wisdom from a multi-generational workforce, and they have different patterns of thinking. So I think the data can help lead you there. I also think data on the candidate side of like, okay, going back to that consistency thing where at the beginning it was consistently choosing candidates or stating that candidates are overqualified, is looking at like, who have they interviewed over the past 12 to 18 months? Who have they hired? And is the data telling us a story that we really do have a potential disparate impact concern here and a risk that we need to act on immediately?
Yeah. Yeah. And so what are some of the, I guess, like competing things that you're looking at here, right? Because there's potentially the legal risk because you could have a whole pool of candidates who were discriminated against in their hiring process and now could have a reason to, file an EEOC claim or something like that. Like
Mhm.
that could be a possibility. Or it could not, right? Again, like try not to make too many assumptions. But what are some of the other risks that you're weighing as you're kind of digging into what could be happening here?
Yeah, so there's a risk on the candidate side. There's also a risk with that manager, which
Hmm.
I think some HR folks might not realize at the outset. And then as you dig in, you realize it's like that as you launch investigation here, you're going to be looking at data on the candidate, but you're also effectively investigating that leader. And so is there a concern that that leader then feels like there's a retaliatory decision made
Hmm.
based on them telling you as the HR professional, I'm not going to hire this person because they're overqualified, and feeling like they could
Yeah.
trust in that conversation. So I think there's sort of both of those. And I'm not a lawyer, so obviously we take partners with our legal team in making those determinations. But I think you sort of have to look at how do you manage the candidate piece where there's been potentially folks that have been impacted by decision making there. And then after that, how do you ensure that the investigation was thorough and you heard that leader out, which is kind of goes back to that first set of questions that you're asking. So
Yeah.
that if you do make an employment decision on that person, that you have evaluated all things to assume that, positive intent before you make that decision.
Yeah. Yeah. And how do you make that decision? Who ultimately makes the decision about this, about what to do here? I mean, is it just HR? Is the manager also involved? Like who sort of owns whatever outcome happens here?
So I do not think HR should ever be making these decisions. Ultimately,
Hmm.
HR is serving up information to leadership to make the decision. We make recommendations, but we shouldn't be firing people in isolation. We really shouldn't be firing anybody. We're guiding on the risk and what we've learned and are making a recommendation to that leader, and that leader then makes the call. So certainly it's a partnership where we are guiding others.
Yeah. I agree, especially when it's like you can only control so much, right? Like you can only control so much of the outcome, so much of how the manager's going to react to something, how much the candidate's going to react to something. And to your point, kind of being that really good guide, offering like a good, better, best scenario even is like really what we're here to do. And then sort of be like, okay, now you take what you know and make the best decision you can in the time. And that's where a lot of the HR work that we do kind of lives in those little moments that aren't necessarily seen by everyone, but are seen and supported a lot in one-on-one type conversations with managers who might not even realize that they could have a pattern of discrimination behind them, right? Like they don't know until you tell them.
Right, exactly. And I think there's sometimes a misconception that HR hires and fires people. We don't. We support teams in hiring and firing decisions, and we are business partners in those moments. And it's super important that we stay in that role, because I think in order to be able to have a relationship that is fruitful with both the employees, with the leaders, and the company, and help run a company, you have to be able to play that role as an influential partner and a guide and a consultant, not as a decision maker.
Yeah. Yeah. Firm agree. And so in sort of situations like this where, I would call it, I know this scenario is very specific to, ageism and hiring, we'll call it broadly, right? Like an overqualified candidate. But in situations where a hiring manager needs a little bit more help and in their interview process and in making those kinds of hiring decisions for whatever reason, right? What are some things that you could put in place before you get a hiring manager like this making a decision based on their own biases that they might not realize they have, right? Like what foundation can you build?
Yeah. So I think apart, from sort of asking the questions and guiding them, I think you do have to educate them on the
Hmm.
laws and here's sort of what expectations are there for you in terms of assessing candidates. These are some what could be can be seen as discriminatory decisions. Here's what we cannot ask questions about. You sort of recalibrate on that, and these are the things that you can lean into. And then after that, you really then I think it's you look at, do you have the right interview guides? Do you need to institute new interview training? Do you need to educate the team on sort of what type of workforce tends to be the most valuable in the organization? So it's like, I think you take multiple parts of that. You also do compliance training, but I think compliance training without all of that education just becomes like teaching somebody HR language. You're not
Yes. Yeah.
actually teaching them sort of why this stuff matters. So I think that could be
Yeah.
part of it, but I would start with the others, which is like, here's what you need to know about interviewing and how do we create structure where you don't even have to think about this. It's sort of just
Yeah.
part of like your process.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. And this is also where, because I used to recruit for a company that mostly hired entry level sales talent. And entry level can mean so many different things. It can mean it's your first job out of college, or it could mean it's your first
Mhm.
sales job. So you could have had other jobs before that, right? So, but when I first started there was sort of this penchant for hiring people right out of college
Mhm.
and, just kind of focusing on that group. And if you're not in that group, then you weren't going to, you were never going to make it past the first or second interview with a manager. And part of what I did there was putting in things like interview calibrations, teaching people about how to read a resume. So
Mhm.
it's even just like some of the basic things that you don't even realize that a lot of managers just don't learn, and they've done, just fine up until this moment. So sometimes we have to be those people that put in some structure but also like force them to question decisions that they've made, decision patterns that they've had before that may be impacting sort of how they have to move ahead too.
Yeah, I love that that's your background. Actually, I started out doing that too. I've got a
Really?
talent acquisition background, was hiring a lot of entry level sales professionals with also the same challenges where
Hmm.
sometimes it's entry level might mean something to somebody that isn't
Yep.
really what we want to be assessing for. So, yes, you do have to put those measures in place. I think everything you just said around the calibration process super important to avoid
Yeah.
bias.
And it's like, it's tough because at first they're just like, oh, more meetings, more
Uh-huh.
HR, just like, messing with our flow of hiring. It's all these things that we've done well before. But then eventually it changes once you start to see some wins. I think this is where it can be really tough in HR is like, we want to make it so that, people are comfortable. We want to make it so that we're being collaborative. But sometimes we have to be the people that are like, no, like you can't keep making decisions like this and we have to stick with it and not just let them revert back to bad behaviors or past behaviors, right? Because it's like not only is it bad for the candidates that it's impacting, but it also keeps the company open to a lot of risk too. And then now you're more involved because you're actively here trying to work on it, right?
Yeah, and there's something you said that I think is so important, like teaching people how to read a resume. I think
Yeah.
sometimes, especially if you're newer to interviewing, you let the resume tell the story versus having the resume just be a guide to kind of to start that story with the
Yes.
candidate, because it is only going to tell you so much, and I think you can get. You can fall into a trap of reading a resume and building the narrative yourself as a hiring
Yes.
manager
Yep.
before you even hear from the candidate.
Oh yeah. Oh man. I could go back on a soapbox about this. Because it's true. I mean, it involves different types of biases in hiring, whether it's ageist or if it's like, you say, oh, you worked at this company, which means that you're going to do really well here because we're in a similar field or we're a similar size, whatever that is. Or the flip side would happen to be like, oh, if I work in a startup and this person's only worked in big corporate environments, they could like sometimes people will look at a resume and immediately discount that person because
Mhm.
they're like, they've never worked in a startup before. They have no idea what it's like. And it's like, well,
Right.
I didn't know what it was like until I worked in a startup. No one does. Like we
Mhm.
all started somewhere. And just like you said, like people who kind of have that narrative just off a resume, it's like you're making too many decisions without having one conversation. And I think it's part of what's making hiring so hard right now too. Like,
Yes.
just too many things, too many decisions are being made with not the correct amount of information.
Right. With what you just said, it's like it's easy to look at that resume and be like, okay, this person's only been in big companies. They're not going to understand a startup environment. What if instead you took the other approach of like, what could this person bring because they
Yes.
haven't been in this environment before and they've been in another environment. It's like flipping the narrative of like, why shouldn't we hire this person to why should we hire this person? And what
Yeah.
do you start to think about if you take that lens?
Ooh, I think that's a really cool, like, that could be a really good tool for someone who might be in this situation too. It's just like, okay, instead of focusing on why we shouldn't, let's think about why we should. Just flip that. Oh, I
Mhm.
love that. I love that. That's a really good takeaway. Okay, so believe it or not, we're actually at time. So I have one
Wow.
last question for you. I know. So in all of this, we talk a lot about assumptions and biases and how they can sort of, maybe impact how we make decisions in a bad way or a good way. There are a lot of assumptions out there about HR and how HR works and what we do. So what's one assumption about HR that you think needs to be challenged?
I love it. And I cannot believe we're out of time. I could have
I
talked
know.
about this all day with you.
I know,
Um,
me too. I have so
I,
many other tangents we could have gone on
oh
to.
my
Maybe like
gosh.
part two, part three. We'll keep going.
I know we might have to. Assumptions on HR. Man, there are many assumptions on HR, but I would say I think there's sometimes fear of HR. Like people will
Mm,
say HR is not your friend. Don't talk to HR. We are your friend, in a lot of ways, and I think that this scenario is a good example of like HR is also we're just trying to get it right too. Like we want to make the right decisions. We want people to be treated fairly. We want the opportunity to educate and make, work at whatever workplace we're in, a place somebody can do the best work of their lives. And so I think that that's really at the end of the day, like we are here for you. We're here for the employer. We're here for the leaders, and we just want to get it right, just like you do.
yeah. Oh, so true. So true. Everyone's just trying to do their job. Everyone's just trying to get it correct. No one's here trying to make it harder for anybody just because it's fun.
Yeah, exactly. Not at all.
Yeah. Well, Natalie, thank you so much. This was so fun. Thank you for being here and for sharing all your wisdom. I feel like there's a lot of really good takeaways for people who are listening to this. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was a blast. Could talk to you all day.
Yeah, I know. Me too. And thank everybody for listening and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.